Mr. Topher Field!
Joining me now is that inspiring and brave Australian documentary filmmaker, Topher Field.
Melbourne, my home. What unfolded here shocked the world and caused many to wonder what happened to Australia. In the middle of it all were ordinary people, people like us. My name is Topher Field. I'm the director of Battleground Melbourne.
Topher is on a mission to empower people.
The only thing that limits government power is the limit of our obedience.
But we realized a deeper truth, that good people break bad laws.
Moral cowardice is the great scourge of our time.
We're here to take back the freedoms that were earned for us by the people that we built this shrine to remember.
This was a military checkpoint. They had the army on these checkpoints. And without irony, saying, papers, please. Our boys in blue wouldn't obey a government tyranny. Excuse me, they will.
Yes.
I understood that my arrest was coming, and I by then I was on the verge of a breakdown.
Hi everyone, Rukshan here, and quick video to alert you to the arrest of Topher Field.
The problem with Australians is not that so many of them are descended from convicts, but that so many are descended from prison officers.
I went as far on one occasion as to saying, yeah, you're absolutely right, I'm inciting. I'm inciting people to exercise their human rights.
And I will accept nothing less than freedom. Freedom for me, freedom for my children, and freedom for us all.
Well, hello and welcome. I'm out of the studio again this week. I'm on the road. I'm down in Melbourne at the moment. So you'll have to forgive the old school kettles and toasters. And I think there's a vinyl just up where is it? There, just there. Some paraphernalia on the walls. I'm in an attic in a secret, undisclosed location. So you'll have to forgive me. But you won't have to forgive me for my guest tonight because he's going to be an absolute ripper. I have Professor Robert Clancy joining me. Now, he and I have actually only met once. It was relatively briefly at an event in Sydney where I had the privilege of emceeing for Professor Clancy, as well as Dr. John Campbell and a bunch of other incredible people. But Professor Clancy very, very kindly agreed to come on and have a good podcast with me, particularly for the purpose of educating me, because I noticed something during COVID. And it's one of those things that I noticed at the time and put aside because, let's be honest, it was a crazy busy time and this was the least of my worries. But I noticed that all of a sudden, everyone was an expert on immunology. Everyone was an expert on the immune system, from journalists who previously knew absolutely nothing. All of a sudden, they're writing journalistic pieces and op-eds, etc., through to every man and his dog on Instagram and Twitter and X. Everybody was all of a sudden an expert in immunology. Well, I'll be honest. I'll put my hand up and say, I don't really know as much as I probably should about how the immune system works. And so this chat with Professor Robert Clancy, arguably Australia's foremost brain on this stuff. He would probably argue with me and tell me that that's not the case, but I'm going to say it anyway before I bring him on so that he can't argue with me and tell me that I'm wrong. I think Professor Robert Clancy would be arguably Australia's foremost brain on the topic of human immunology and the human immune system. And he's also a fantastic communicator. So I plan to learn a lot tonight. And thank you very much for joining me here tonight. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, you'll be pleased to know that you can actually make comments. And just like Tim Molesworth saying good day here, I can actually put your comments and your questions up on the screen. This is all happening in real time. So if you have a question for Professor Robert Clancy that's somewhat on topic, please, then please throw it in the chat, throw it in the questions. And if I like the question, and if I think it's a good one, if it's an insightful question or one that I'm curious about myself, then I will happily put it on the screen and ask Professor Clancy to give us his thoughts on that particular question. Alrighty, is that all the housekeeping done? I think it might be. Oh, by the way, I'm Topher Field, and you've tuned into another legendary Topher Field slow chat / podcast. Keep those comments pouring in, and without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Professor Robert Clancy. Professor Clancy, how are you?
I'm fine. Nice to
Thank
be
you
here.
so much. Well, thank you so much for volunteering your Thursday evening. You could be doing any one of a bunch of other things, I'm sure, but you've chosen to spend it here with us. Now, we actually met briefly in Sydney you were, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you were the man responsible for bringing Dr. John Campbell out to Australia.
No, it was a new
No.
grandson in Perth that was responsible for bringing both John and his wife to Australia. John and I had got to know each other. I guess it's one of the few benefits of the COVID era, but we got to know each other through overlap of interests, and we've become quite good friends. And I've stayed with him in England, and I said, look, when you come to Australia, please come across to Sydney, you know, the home of freedom and good ideas. And so John came, and as did Chris, and we had a wonderful time. And we thought that if John was coming, given that he has something like 25% of his audience, a world audience, is Australian, and he's got an audience of well over 3 million, we thought it'd be a terrific idea to use that as an opportunity to bring together people from all backgrounds to really look at some of the questions that I think COVID has put up, and perhaps provide at least a direction towards getting some of the answers in a very, very difficult time and a difficult topic.
Well, it was a terrific day. Just off the top of my head, we had Professor Gigi Foster, Professor James Allen, and so many others. There were just amazing people there. I had the privilege of emceeing, and there's actually been a publication. So the Australian Medical Professional Society put their name on the event, and they've actually made a publication. I believe it's called COVID Revisited, if my memory serves me correctly. And they have put that out recently. So I'm pretty sure if you go to the Australian Medical Professionals Society's website, you'll be able to find that publication that came out of Dr. Campbell coming over. And that's also how we met very, very briefly, but I'm very, very glad that we did. Just before I move on to my next question, Agate Master 199 is getting to the really important topics for the evening. He's asking, what cigar tonight? Well, I regret to tell you that under this new revised format, I no longer smoke my cigars live during slow chats. I used to do that, Professor Clancy. You probably wouldn't approve from a health perspective, but I did used to sit here with whiskey and a cigar during COVID. It was my healthcare plan. My mental health care plan was to sit here with whiskey and cigars every Thursday night and have fantastic conversations with people. I regret to inform you, Agate Master, that the cigars are now a thing of the past.
You're doing that so we don't have to.
Well, that's right. Well, look, I read, and it's reputable, that actually smoking was negatively correlated with vulnerability to the COVID virus itself. A number of French studies, I believe, came out and showed that quite clearly. So really, what I was doing was maintaining my health and protection against a deadly virus for the sake of the elderly and vulnerable. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Some studies go the other way.
So some certainly do, but you know what? I can just cherry pick the ones that suit me. Isn't that how science works? That's how medical science works, isn't it?
That's how narrative works.
Well, it is indeed, and we got a masterclass in narratives from governments around the world, and Australia was no exception. Now, you were someone who showed yourself to be pretty fearless and pretty willing to speak what you believed to be the truth all the way through that nonsense. Can we just begin with the basics? Because I'm willing to put my hand up and be the idiot in the room and just say, I'm not convinced that I really understand the human immune system as well as I should. I listen to people talking about it. It seems very complicated. There's a lot of terminology that I don't really understand. There's some concepts that I'm pretty sure I've got my head around, but there's a lot that I feel like I don't. Can we begin tonight with just help me out? What's the Immunology 101 in sort of 5 or 10 minutes, if you can?
Well, that is a challenge. I had mentioned that John Campbell and I put together 4 episodes of we call 101 Immunology, really looking at the background of COVID. And it's a terrific thing to do and a great question to ask, Topher, because I've said right from the beginning that the decisions that have been made in Australia and probably in many other parts of the Western world with respect to COVID, particularly with vaccines, with early treatment, many other things, have been not based on science or understanding. The people making decisions on the genetic vaccines we've had clearly do not understand the lessons of 80 years of influenza vaccination. They don't understand that immunology is about protection, but there are 2 broad different systems. There's a system that protects the inside of the body. That's called systemic immunology. Now, this is a system that cannot tolerate having one bug floating around in your bloodstream. It has to be sterilizing. It has to be highly efficient, because if you get bugs, bacteria, and virus floating around in the bloodstream, that's potentially lethal very quickly. And so there's this pristine, sterile environment. Now, when you come to the surface of the body, it's not like that, because it's communicating with the outside world. We're eating food. We're breathing in bacteria and viruses as we talk. I can remember when I was doing microbiology as an undergraduate medical student, the professor, who was really quite a character, the great Professor de Berg, sadly no longer with us, made us take a Petri dish, a dish with culture medium, and we took the top off it and we just put it on the desk. And we left it there. And we came back the next day, and it was covered in little spots with all the bacteria that had descended. It was, I thought, what a silly thing to do. But I still remember, I don't remember anything else about that whole course, let alone what we did in experiments. But I remember looking at, I couldn't believe the number of bugs that had actually landed on that. And we're breathing these in all the time. And so you need a system that's going to allow the oxygen to come into the body, the carbon dioxide, which is a metabolic product of all the energy producing processes that occur within the body, to get out of the body. But at the same time, you've got to have at that selective membrane a protection system that does not allow those bugs to overwhelm you. And the system that's developed to do that is addressing a very different challenge to the system that's inside you, which is trying to give you a sterilized environment. So you've got the sterilizing immune system, which we call systemic immunity. And most of your viewers, they must, even the Sydney Morning Herald, that doesn't get many things in science right, understands IgG. It's an antibody that floats around in the blood. And the antibody that is stuck at the surface is a very different one. It's one that blocks bad bacteria getting into the body. It doesn't set off a hand grenade, which is what the IgG antibody does. So you've got different mechanisms of protection. And these systems don't communicate very well. So you've got two different systems aimed at doing two different things. One, controlling a sterile environment. One, controlling an environment that is interacting with the outside world and is covered in bacteria and viruses. And so it has to have a different strategy. Now, what happens with COVID is that the COVID bug is breathed in, and so it is meeting this mucosal site where you've got the turmoil of all these bacteria. You've got an immune system that is selectively geared to basically prevent that virus as best it can getting into the rest of the body or getting into the systemic compartment. But if it gets into the systemic compartment, all hell goes loose. The grenades go off. And so what makes COVID different to the coronaviruses, which we've all been getting since we were born? It's a common, the coronaviruses change so that it can actually move out of that mucosal compartment further down into where the gas is actually exchanged, the alveolar system, these little tiny thin areas which are like little sacs where the oxygen can go in and the carbon dioxide comes out. That is protected by the IgG systemic system. So you got this concept that you've got the two systems. COVID becomes a problem when it moves out of the conducting tissue, the passages, the bronchi, the various tubes that conduct the gases into where the actual gases get into the body. So when that happens, you move from a mucosal immune system to the systemic immune system. So what happens if you inject vaccine? If you take the traditional flu vaccine, you inject a basic ground up bit of the flu, you inject that to stimulate systemic immunity. Now, you tell me, Topher, what do you think that systemic immunity is going to do? Why have that when you've got a bug coming into a compartment, which is the mucosal compartment? What do you think that IgG antibody, why bother stimulating an IgG antibody? Well, what do you think it would do? If you don't know, just say so, and we won't.
No, I don't know, but let me play with that idea. I mean, look, I'm happy to be embarrassed. I've already admitted I don't know this stuff. I mean, obviously, that's only going to come into play if the mucosal system has already failed to keep the virus out. It's only once, right?
Exactly. So what we're saying is this IgG systemic immunity is going to make no difference to you or me getting infected. So we're going to get infected. We're going to get COVID. And it's no different to us breathing it out. So the person next to you might get it. Is that clear? And so having a vaccine is going to make basically no difference to people getting infected or people infecting other people. And these, I'll be careful how I describe them because some of them used to be my friends, but some of the people who were getting up and talking on TV every night either didn't have a clue what they were talking about or a bit disingenuous, or they were just taking a party line that they were paid to take. I don't know. I just don't know. I don't understand what happened. But the vaccine was never going to stop you getting infected. It was never going to stop you infecting other people. What it would do, if it was working properly, it would neutralize the impact of the virus escaping into the systemic compartment. And that is what would be causing serious disease, reflected in going to hospital or perhaps intensive care or even dying. So even in can I just pause you? Can I pause you here just for a moment? Sorry.
Yeah. So even in a best case scenario where these injections do exactly what it said on the tin that they were supposed to do, it could not possibly reduce transmission. It would only be measurable, assuming that it even worked in the first place, in the form of severity of disease, hospital admissions, and death. It could not possibly be visible in terms of the reproduction numbers and the spread of the virus.
Absolutely. And this knowledge must have been known. If it wasn't known, then people like yourself haven't done our job properly and taught them.
Okay.
It's scary.
So, well, I mean, it's so obvious when you put it in those terms. It's remarkable that such an obvious thing. I mean, they were literally telling us that it would stop transmission, and yet you're telling me that that could not possibly have been the case, even if the product were perfect.
And it would be known from 80 years of developing flu vaccines. Remember, flu and COVID have a lot of common background common issues that mean you can learn from the flu and apply that to COVID.
Yeah.
Flu vaccine is worth having when there's flu around, but it's not it's not the centerpiece. It's never been the centerpiece. This is what was the big difference with COVID. Because of issues that were outside of our country, for the very first time of the pandemic, we had decisions being made for us by political and economic persuasions and probably military persuasions that existed outside of our country. They were imposed on us, and we were not smart enough or good enough to say, wait a second, we want to make our decisions. We had a local vaccine made by a colleague of mine in South Australia, which was just as good as any of these messenger RNA ones without any problems, without the problems. And yet it was basically banned. So we have very, very serious questions that must be answered. I don't know all the answers, but I know the questions.
No. So let's stay on the South Australia topic for a moment. I don't recall the doctor's name. I met him briefly, and he was recently kicked out of his laboratory. And unless something changed last time I heard an update on his situation.
Professor Nick Petrovsky, the most appalling thing that's happened in Nick, great guy, good guy. Outstanding.
What's the update on him? Because I haven't heard an update since he essentially lost his appeal.
He did. He was given 24 hours notice to close down a laboratory. I mean, this has been a fight going on for some time. But remember, there are not many great scientific breakthroughs and developments from Australia, which we had a tradition of doing in pandemics. Nick, I think he produced the first vaccine produced in Australia for 40 years.
Wow.
And it's been sold, 10 million doses have been sold very successful in the Middle East. but not in Australia. I mean, you've got to ask yourself why. It
Okay.
is, unless something that I haven't been told, that I can't see, and I don't know what that is, then it's very, very disappointing.
Yeah, no, it's devastating, and it's just such a clear-cut case of bureaucratic overreach, in my personal opinion. Coming back to the mucosal immune system, if we then did want to stop something like a coronavirus or a flu, any of these ones that enter via the airways, if we did want to stop those in the mucosal immune system before they reach the systemic immune system, are there vaccines that act in that theater, or what do you do to improve your immune system at that level?
Well, that's a good question. No vaccine is going to be so effective for preventing an infection from an inhaled pathogen like a flu any better than you'll find in the flu story. Now, with the flu story of vaccines, you have, as I said, 80 years of development of injected vaccines. And more recently, or actually for some time, people have said, well, let's stimulate the local immune response by taking a watered down type of flu virus and breathe it in. Now, that's had a long-standing history. There are commercial variants of this. They've never been proved particularly effective. And there's a reason for this. But the basic reason is that to protect the body from blowing up, from reacting violently or non-violently to this sea of microbes that are exposed to the gut and the lung, there is high-level downregulation, suppression of immunity. And so you have this yin-yang sort of approach. You breathe in a virus, you make an immune response, and you make it in a different way, which we may or may not get to, but you also very quickly bring in the downregulators so that you don't overreact. Now, that downregulation is also critical to understand. If you only want to understand two things about immunology from this, understand that it's compartmentalized. The systemic and the mucosal compartments are very different and they don't communicate very well. And the second thing is the mucosal compartment is dominated by suppression, turning off immunity. And that domination is spread from the airways to the rest of the body. Now, many of you have been concerned that you have a vaccine and someone says, well, you need a booster 2 or 3 months later. You all remember having vaccines when you were kids against tetanus and whooping cough and diphtheria. You have, a set of vaccines early in life, and maybe when you get much older, so let's have, a top up. But we understand vaccines usually, the injected vaccines, work for a long time. So why is it that we're suddenly, I know people have had 5 vaccines in 2 years. It doesn't say very much for the vaccine, does it? But that's totally predictable, because what is different between, say, a measles vaccine, and remember the measles vaccine is stopping the measles going through the bloodstream to get to the skin or the lung to cause its problems. And so you have IgG antibody, this systemic immune response, and you can get sterilizing immunity because the virus has to go through the bloodstream to have its effect. Very different to an inhaled virus. Big difference. Inhaled virus through the bloodstream virus. And so you can set up a systemic immune response, which lasts many, many years. But when it comes to the inhaled virus, the mucosal or local immune response is transient and is both stimulating a positive protective response and a negative suppressing response. And the dominant one becomes the negative one. And this is why when you have a vaccine, the dominant negativity becomes the major determinant of the outcome. And so after 3 or 4 months, you've got no protection left because you've got this suppressing T cell, suppressor cell, the particular subset of T cells, which is turning off systemic immunity, even though it was primarily a mucosal infection. Now, you ask yourself, everyone who knows about allergies if you have a lot of allergies and you go to the allergist is going to say, oh, look, I've got a good treatment. You're allergic to pollens. We'll have some shots, allergy shots. Now, Topher, you've heard of allergy shots? What's the difference between an allergy shot? Okay, so you've got an allergy shot to stop you getting a big reaction to pollens that you're inhaling. There's no difference. The respiratory tract that's breathing in the pollen, it can't really tell much of a difference between the virus and the pollen. I mean, there are differences, of course, but it sees them as foreign antigens. And so the way the body responds to the pollen is the same way as it's going to respond to the virus. And the way we treat the pollen sensitivity is give a sequence of 4 or 5 injections. And so when you give 4 or 5 injections for a virus, you're going to turn off the protective immunity you do want to get with the virus. So there's no difference between so you've got, and it's been so, just last week, the data came out from the Cleveland Clinic. Now, everyone knows the Cleveland Clinic. It's one of the best known, one of the best medical centers in the world. And they've brought out 2 publications now, maybe more, but I've seen 2. And they can't understand why it is, they're beginning to understand now, that you have 3 shots for the COVID vaccine, and suddenly, if you're over the age of 60, with 3 shots, you've got 2.5 times greater chance of getting COVID than the persons who had no shots. Now, that's all published in the legitimate medical literature. The Brits found this when they were advertised every week. They'd bring out the data of how the antibodies were going and how the infection rates were going, whether you they were proudly showing how you got less protection or greater protection with a vaccine. Then suddenly, after 3, and you looked at it for a month or 2, they were getting more infections. Now, that occurred 2 years ago. Suddenly, they stopped putting out their figures. The Australian government, New South Wales government anyway, have stopped putting out their figures. And, yeah, maybe I'm just a cynic, but you ask why. And the Cleveland Clinic has actually now published their data showing the increasing rate of infection for people who have had multiple infections. And the great danger here, now, I'm hoping someone who makes decisions is watching your show, because what we're doing is we're having repeated injections for COVID that aren't doing much, but they're sustaining a little bit of immunity because it's stopping you getting negative immunity and proneness to infection. Right. So if you stop having your injections after 3 or 4, you're putting yourself in danger and at risk of having more infections and more severe infections. You find that most of the hospitals start getting filled up with people who are fully vaccinated. Now, none of this should be surprising. So that's an amazing discourse. I just need you to slow down for a second because my brain is catching up. My brain is trying to keep up here. There are two parts to this that I think need to. Mine. Sorry. It's younger than mine. No, look, I'm doing my best. I assure you. There's 2 parts to this. It could be argued, and I would disagree, but nevertheless, the argument could be made that we needed to rush out a vaccine. This was a horrible, terrible, once in 100-year virus that we just had to take a risk on an experimental vaccine, etc. And that argument at least has some basis in being interested in public good at the very least. I would very highly dispute that argument, but that argument could be made. Once the data begins to come back saying this isn't working, or in fact, this may even be having a negative effect, that argument is no longer valid. Do you have a hypothesis? Do you have an explanation that you believe might be true as to why the powers that be would have persisted and continued to roll out these vaccines to encourage people to get boosted, in some cases to increase the range of age groups, etc., that were eligible to get them, even after we began to see the data that you just talked about coming out? Well, you're absolutely right. There's every reason in the world to try to get a vaccine quickly, and I was all for that. But let me make 2 points. If you go back to the flu pandemic, so back in the 50s and 60s, they had a new flu vaccine ready within 6 months. It took them over 12 months to use the new messenger RNA vaccine, and the Chinese had traditional flu-like vaccines, which are at least as good and certainly less dangerous. They had those traditional antigen, what we call antigen vaccines, within, I think it was about 2 months after the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines came out. And I can bet you pounds to peanut that they didn't have the money and the energy put into their production that the American vaccines had. So it is not correct. I mean, the one big push was, we have this fantastic new experimental, never been used genetic vaccine, which, as all of us know who understand a little bit about this, it's gene therapy. It's not they're not vaccines. It's genetic material that tells a cell, every cell in the body, make a spike protein, make something that's part of that virus, so we can then make an immune response and stop getting an infection. And of course, I'm not sure if you want to get onto the problems of these vaccines, but that's certainly part of it, that the whole body is basically making it rather than the isolated lymph node or close lymph nodes, as you do with an antigen vaccine. So the idea of speed is important, but making an antigen vaccine is not that much slower than the messenger RNA ones. And let's face it, they haven't done too well, have they? They've lagged behind the change. And there are many people, I'm not a virologist, I'm an immunologist, but there are many virologists who believe that the fact we're still in the middle of a pandemic, really. We've still got lots of virus around, a lot of people getting sick, and quite a few dying still. The suggestion is that the vaccines have actually created, certainly some of the antiviral treatments create aberrant new types of virus, which are new variants, and continue the pandemic. So we don't know the answer to a lot of these questions. We know very few answers, actually.
I think the number one thing that we know is that we don't know nearly as much as we give ourselves credit for. I think if this particular pandemic has taught us anything, it's a reminder to be a little bit more humble in the face of nature as a species. But that's my sort of personal opinion on it. I interviewed Dr. Naomi Wolf some time ago, and she, of course, is spearheading a task force going through the Pfizer papers, a massive document dump. Pfizer tried to keep these documents hidden for, 70 years or so, and then they dumped hundreds of thousands of pages. And I think, I think they went from, oh no, we're not going to show them to you, to the opposite strategy. We're going to dump so many documents that there's no way you're going to be able to sift through them and find anything incriminating. And with the help of the War Room and Steve Bannon, Dr. Wolf was able to put together a task force, and I interviewed her on this. The thing that she said that didn't catch me off guard, that's not the right expression, that I think impacted me the most, and I'd like to run it past you and get your thoughts on this as well. She said point blank, and I queried her on it to make sure that I had not misunderstood, and so I believe I am accurately paraphrasing Dr. Naomi Wolf. She said that it is her belief that the vaccine adverse events, particularly in relation to the reproductive system, were intentional. She was quite clear, and she doubled down on that when I queried that. Now, I'm a bit of an Occam's razor guy. Simplest explanation is usually correct, not always, but usually correct. And also never attribute to malice that which can also be explained by incompetence. So I find that leap. I accept that these vaccines are doing an enormous amount of harm. I think that's been well established in the data. But to make the leap to intent is quite a big leap in my view. Do you have an opinion on that?
Look, I said before this, Topher, I'm not going to get into the political sphere. I'm not going to get into the genetic purity sphere. Look, I'll say this, that the when a vaccine's developed, no matter what the vaccine, you do preclinical studies, you do studies on laboratory animals, and you start looking at where's the vaccine going, what's it doing to the fertility system of the animal. And I remember I went back and read through the preclinical data that was released. It was scanty. It's absolutely scanty. It was shamefully scanty. And when I did look at it, it was an area that I knew a little bit about and other people hadn't picked up on. But what it showed in mice was that the implantation of fertilized eggs seemed to be delayed. And so it struck me that, and I wouldn't for a moment even like to think that anyone was doing anything intentionally. I would like to think it was very sloppy, unnecessarily sloppy, and certainly incomplete. And as far as I can see, had never, ever, they haven't gone back and done it properly. But what they were showing in the scanty things they did was that there was an impaired implantation of the fertilized ovum. And when the vaccine was put into the body of, say, a mouse or a rat or a small animal, it concentrated in certain organs. That was part of the reason for this is the messenger RNA, which is the active part of the vaccine. We're using the term loosely, the vaccine, was incorporated in basically a very, very small particle, which was made of lipids, a lipid nanoparticle. And I'm not aware of this type of process being used in humans as a form of vaccination before. So all of these aspects were novel and untested, but because of the lipid nature, these vaccines didn't stay in one part of the body, as some people were telling us. They were distributed through the whole body, and they were concentrating in certain organs. And one of the organs they concentrated in was the ovary, the liver, the adrenal gland, various organs which have high lipid content. And so you've got a lipid-based vaccine going around in the bloodstream, and it pops out where there's a lot of lipid. And wherever it pops out, it's going to, messenger RNA will go in, take over the ribosome, the protein factory of the cell, and produce the spike protein as a priority. And so you're going to get spike protein produced not just in the architectural components that have evolved to handle a new infection or a vaccine, but any of the cells in the body. And this is totally different to anything we'd ever come across before, totally different. And you can imagine you've got foreign protein potentially expressed on every cell in the body, including the germ cells, which are in the ovary and the testis. And we know just from vaccinating teenage boys that in Thailand, a very important study was done where they vaccinated the boys. I can't remember if it was the first or second vaccine, and then they followed very carefully to see how many of those boys had some evidence of potential damage in the heart. We all know that 1 in 5, 1 in 600 or so people who are vaccinated, young people particularly, can get clinical myocarditis if you look for it. The harder you look for it, the more you'll find. But what they did is they looked using MRI, high sensitivity technology, and they found somewhere between 2 and 3% of these boys were getting evidence of minute areas of damage in the heart by measuring a particular protein called troponin, which appeared in the blood as a result of damage to heart cells, and they could see this inflammation on the MRI that they were doing. Other people followed it up with much more sensitive scans using radioactive markers, and found, I can't remember, it was something like 60-70% of people showed increased uptake. So, this is happening. This is happening. And we have no idea what potential danger that will be. These are things that should have been sorted out long before they started imposing. Something like 60 to 70% of the world's population has now had a genetic vaccine. 60 to 70% of the world's population has been given these vaccines. Now, I would hate to think that there was ever any negative intent. I've heard the stories, but I just can't. I'm a physician. My job is to keep people well and alive, and it's beyond my capacity to think that such malicious intent could occur.
Look, I wish I could wholeheartedly agree with you, but I have to say, I pushed back when Naomi Wolf said that. I said, look, that's a big call. And she asked me a rhetorical question that has stuck with me ever since. She said, if it was your intention to reduce the population via reduced reproduction rates, would you do it any other way? And I had to admit, I struggled to think of a more elegant way to do it. People lined up and volunteered to receive these jabs. It was for their own good, and so therefore they said thank you afterwards. I don't know. I'm not stating a conclusion. I found Dr. Wolf's line of reasoning quite compelling. Moving to some slightly happier territory, if I may.
It's pretty worth saying a couple of things that are related to the genetics, because this is a story that even you and I aren't going to believe. Last year, in the middle of the year, a Nobel Prize was given to two individuals for coming up with a clever way of putting a pseudo base. If your messenger RNA is just made up of four bases and nucleotides, and they wanted to make it work longer and get into the cells more quickly. And so a guy and a girl came up with a system whereby you could replace one of them, one called uridine, with pseudouridine. And this was basically what they got the Nobel Prize for. By December of last year, the Cambridge group had shown that one of the main reasons why we're so concerned about this messenger RNA is the pseudouridine is leading to a misreading. Now, you can imagine you've got a factory called a ribosome, and that ribosome's lining up the messenger RNA so you can tell the components of the protein how they could line up to make a protein. And what they found was there was a shift in the actual ones, the sequences being read. And so if you imagine, here's the messenger RNA. You're supposed to match the base pairing like this, so you're producing totally different proteins.
Sorry, everyone. We've just lost Professor Robert Clancy. It seems he's on a very slow internet connection. I apologize. I'm struggling at times to actually hear him. And as you've seen, his image is pretty fuzzy. Can you just jump in the comments for me and let me confirm for me, just to make sure that there's no problem at my end, that my image is clearer and that my audio is coming through better than what his was? I believe it's a problem at his end, and there's not much I can do about that. I'm going to give him a good couple of minutes to come back, because there's hundreds upon hundreds of people watching, and I'm really enjoying that chat, and I'm wanting to be able to continue. I'm really enjoying watching some of the haters in Facebook and other things, other places. Dude, if you've got such a problem with him, leave. Like, honestly. It amazes me. These are the sorts of conversations that we've been needing to have for a very long time, and I think the real sin, the real tragedy of COVID is not only that the governments and the powers that be got it so terribly wrong, but that they actively colluded in order to suppress and, in many cases, deregister and destroy the careers of the people who did actually get it right. All right, Professor Clancy is just rejoining now. Here he is. Now, Professor,
someone shut us.
That's all right. Can you?
What I was saying was that, so 1 in 3 people are producing completely foreign proteins instead of the spike protein. No one knows what that means. Some of those proteins seem to have the characteristic of folding in what we call amyloid 2, which we know is a component of cerebral brain degenerative disease. So, there's so many unanswered questions.
Now, Professor, can you see if you can find the button down the bottom of your screen to turn your camera off? We're just having some bandwidth issues at your end. And I think if you turn your camera off and you just go to audio only, we might have a bit of a better time. So down the bottom of your screen, there'll be just a little picture of a camera. And if you click on that, it'll turn red, and a slash will go through it, and you'll switch over to audio only. And then, okay, lovely. All right. So apologies, everyone. You're going to have to look at just my face, and we're just going to listen to Professor Clancy. I do apologize, but hopefully that's going to mean that Professor Clancy's audio will come through a lot better, and we'll be able to have a good listen. So, Professor, For those that were coerced, I mean, you're talking about 60 to 70% of the global population having had these jabs. We're talking about, according to the official numbers, 90, 95%, whatever it is officially, in Australia having had at least one or two. For those that are concerned, for those that are hearing these numbers and seeing these studies out of Thailand and elsewhere, and they're concerned about what might have happened to them, is there anything that someone can do, even at a sort of a precautionary level, in the absence of any sort of diagnosis, that studies are indicating might be beneficial to them?
Not really. I think that the important thing is people try to understand what the options are, understand the process, and become involved in the decision-making process. And, you know, I think, to me, one of the saddest things that's been an outcome of this whole pandemic has been that, you know, the bruising of the doctor-patient relationship, which traditionally is where decisions are made.
Yeah.
And you know, I think that on one hand, on the second hand, I don't think my profession, who are at the coalface, have been properly instructed in terms and given the information that does exist. They've been given a party line, and they, you know, most of them believe it.
And the thing that concerns me is not only that happened, and I think you're absolutely right, but also that there appears to be now, in response, even with all of what we know, all of the information that's come out since, the response is now from the government to kind of double down on that. We're seeing the rise of the e-safety commissioner here in Australia, and that's obviously not just to do with medical information, but certainly is also to do with medical information. We're seeing, you know, the AHPRA and so forth don't appear to be really backing down at all. So it seems to me as though not only were terrible mistakes made, but at this moment in time, lessons don't appear to be being learned. Am I missing anything? Are you seeing any signs for optimism in terms of just actually learning something from this?
Well, no, my impression is that people don't want to learn. I think there's a lot of culpability, a lot of embarrassment, a lot of pride. It's hard to know what the dominant emotion is, but I think increasingly people are asking questions. You know, my patients, most of them are very well informed, and they're concerned. But I think it's time for. I think part of the problem has been that we're getting decisions made by bureaucrats who don't look after patients. I see people making the most extraordinary comments on some treatment options who haven't got a clue what they're talking about and have never seen a sick patient, and yet they're experts. We have, you know, these people appearing on television night after night, perhaps less so now, but certainly early on. And I just shook my head. I looked up the background of a few of them, and from anthropology through to I don't know. I'll give you an example. There was a terrible article. I can't even remember. I think it was probably on ivermectin or something like that on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald. So I wrote a letter to the reporter, who was some young kid who seemed as though she was 20 or 21, who normally was a crime reporter, but she suddenly became an expert on whatever this topic was. And so I wrote her a nice letter and said, look, you know, I'd love to have a chat to her. I'm not thinking she'd even get back to me. And anyway, she did. She said, oh, we only publish randomized controlled trials. I was surprised she could even spell it. And so I said, that's terrific, because, you know, there are 35 controlled trials for the medicine. And of course, I never heard another word from her. But and this is there's no conversation. I've tried twice. I've contacted AHPRA and said, look, I don't know if you know me or not, but I know more about mucosal immunology as it applies to this type of area than probably anyone else in this country. I would love to have you free, just to give you some advice, because clearly you're making decisions that are outside of the scientific frame. On both occasions, I got no, not even the courtesy of a reply. Not even the courtesy of a reply.
I wish I could tell you that I was shocked, Professor, but But sadly, I'm not. And there is that expression, there is none so blind as those that will not see. And I think you've hit it on the head. There is no appetite to learn, because learning requires admitting that you got something wrong. I know you don't want to talk about the political side of things, but it's a timely thing to mention that just over the weekend, we saw that the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty amendments have not gone through in their current form. Now, that's not a final victory. We're not out of the woods in terms of that yet. But certainly there's more argy-bargy to be had, and that means that there is more time for us to continue to put pressure on and to try and make sure that those reforms don't go through, and that we don't give any additional power to sort of centralized health bureaucracies. But Professor, what would you like to see in medicine? How can we change how medicine is done in this country so that the mistakes of the last couple of years are not repeated? There are those who say, well, we need to concentrate more power into the hands of the World Health Organization, and that's how we should manage pandemics in the future. How would you like to see us managing pandemics in the future?
Okay, well, the World Health Organization, I know a lot about it. I've interacted with many of their people over many years. It was brought in to do certain jobs. And what it's done is it's broadened its remit, it's broadened its the range of influences that are on it, and it now is a long way from what it was developed to do. The idea of having one size fit all is totally ridiculous. And we must remember that many of the great problems that came out through COVID were promoted, initiated by the World Health Organization. It's powerfully influenced by the pharma companies. It's powerfully influenced by individual interests. It has bias, and the word corruption is probably not an unreasonable one to use. The very thought that it could tell Australia how to run its medicine is so ridiculous, so potentially dangerous, that every Australian should be up in arms at the very idea that this could occur. We have an incredibly competent, proud system of handling pandemics in this country. It all fell apart with COVID. It fell apart because we allowed ideas that vested interests outside of the country benefited from. Pfizer to the tune of $100 billion a year, and probably the American military and certainly the American politics. They plonked this thing on us, and that has never happened before. We've coped extremely well with pandemics relevant to other countries because we've had a very powerful medical, very powerful scientific group. What has happened, I think, is that in the last 30, 40 years, the powerful medical centralized medicine has changed. I'm a physician, so I belong to the College of Physicians. When I was training and I became a young physician, the great aim in all of our lives would have been to be the president of the College of Physicians. I wouldn't even know the name of the college. But no one in their right mind would want to be the president of the College of Physicians because it's an effete body. It's tied up with the narrative. It's tied up with woke politics. And most of my colleagues have just shook their head and say, well, we pay our amount of money each year so that we can practice as a physician. And it's a very sad thing. So what I'd love to see is the college programs regain the strength of influence that they once had, that we go for the very best people and not basically people who've become career politicians running these shows. So we've lost all of that. It's such a mess that it's very hard to know where to start.
Well, one of the things that became very clear very early in COVID was that, at least for a little while, dissenting voices were allowed to speak. It took a few months for the real censorship to really kick in, and I was grateful for that because it was in February and March of 2020 that I was reading data out of Israel, out of Sweden, out of Italy. Professor Johnny Ioannidis began to speak up internationally, and he initially at least began to get some press. And he wasn't so much telling us what was definitely going on, but he was certainly a wise voice of caution. And if I recall correctly, the title of one of his articles was along the lines of, "We're making very big decisions on the basis of very limited data." That was essentially his his thesis and his warning to us all. But one of the things that became very, very clear to me was the need, I think, for the average layperson to get better at discerning between competing experts, because this is what was presented to us. Was you had the government picked experts on the television who would stand there at the press conference next to the Premier with a very ashen, grave face, and the Premier would open and say a few things and then introduce the medical expert to come and give us an update and tell us what was going on. And these were the experts that we were told to listen to. As you've rightly pointed out, in order to get into that position, that's really a bureaucratic position. Many of those people have, in some cases, never practiced actual medicine, and in many cases have been out of it for decades by the time they get into those positions. But even putting that aside, these were the people presented to us as experts. Then on the other hand, we had on and off in between censorship, people like Professor Johnny Ioannidis, people like yourself, people like Dr. Gupta and so many others, the names, Dr. Ian Brighthope and so many more in Australia and around the world. What became clear to me was that the average layperson does not have the capacity or a framework within which to compare the opinions of competing experts. Is it possible, or is it just a pipe dream? Do you think it's possible? Is there a framework? Is there a way of looking at what's being presented to you that might allow a layperson who does not have any specialist industry knowledge to be able to at least get a sense of which of these people is more likely to be telling me the truth? Which of these people is less likely to be compromised by other interests? Is there a way to achieve that, or is that just a pipe dream?
Well, I don't think it's a pipe dream, but I certainly don't have all the answers. I think when you look at what's happened, I find that I have great confidence in the intelligence and the smartness of the average man in the street. I'm constantly refreshed by talking to patients or people I just meet, and when they know what I do, they enter into a discussion wanting to know answers. I think it's got to be an education process. I mentioned earlier the importance of trying to realign the education process in medicine, because it really has fallen off the tree. I mean, my own, the family practitioners who are friends of mine are still giving people Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, which is costing the Australian taxpayer over $1,000 a pop. And the latest studies, the Paxlovid one that came out showed zero benefit. The Molnupiravir was, I'm not even sure they use it much in England anymore, because they looked at 24,000 people. It was an Oxford study, showed zero benefits. And here we have drugs like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, which have been given a terrible time. And yet they're incredibly effective drugs. I've offered to debate people. I've offered to talk. I mean, I don't like doing these. I think you're a great guy, Topher, but I seriously don't enjoy. No, I seriously don't enjoy going on this sort of program. I describe myself as someone who's seriously old, who has a lot of things that I'd want to do, and I certainly didn't plan on spending 8, 9, 10 hours a day keeping up with what's going on in COVID.
Yeah.
It's not what I planned to do when I was my age.
Well, we appreciate your service, and
we're so busy. We're so busy. I can do it because I've reduced my clinical practice. I don't have a big clinical practice, and I basically have the time. I think the average family practitioner is so flat tack, so busy, and the same with. And people in specialty areas are a long way from this type of immunology. And so you accept, we've been brought up to accept expert evidence. And we used to believe the government and the government people representing the government, and they've let us down.
Well, to be fair, we should be able to trust them. I don't really judge people that did trust the experts, so to speak, in the early days of COVID. It's a shame. I certainly saw through it very early on, but I don't judge people that trusted, because we should have been able to trust.
Of course, I agree.
We
should get back to that.
Yes, yes. Well, that's the tone of my next question. You've been in medicine for a very, very long time. If you don't mind me saying, you're towards the end of your career. For people that are considering entering medicine, that could become our next generation and may unfortunately find themselves having to stand up at a time like, you know, COVID-19 2.0, so to speak. What are the traits that those people need to have, and what would your advice be to someone who's looking at getting into medicine at this point in time, knowing what we know now about the corruption of the medical system?
Well, firstly, I say congratulations. You've chosen the greatest profession on earth. I have a policy. I wake up every Monday morning and I say, thank God it's Monday. And I always say, when you stop doing that, you're in the wrong job, you're in the wrong position, you get out of it. And I've never stopped doing that. And I've been practicing, as you know, for well over 50 years. So the first thing is, congratulations, you've taken on a great profession. I think the people who really, really make good doctors are the people who ask questions. The people who don't just see somebody with a particular set of symptoms and act as though 80% of people are going to have this and that. The people who really ask questions and say, what could be going on? What's happening? If they're that sort of person, they're going to ask the same sort of questions when it comes to when the power structures change, when they're being told something about a COVID vaccine, which is different to what they were told about the flu vaccine. And they're saying, well, what's the difference? Or they just simply say, but you're not giving a vaccine. You're injecting me with genetic material. Where's it going to go? Is it going to end up in my DNA? Well, which it does, which it can, of course. But we were told it wouldn't. So I think the natural inquiry, and I guess I bored a lot of people through my life by asking questions. I ask questions of everyone and anyone because I'm fascinated to know. I love getting answers. I love understanding. I love ideas. So yeah, I think there are a lot of really important qualities. But I think tenacity, really liking people, and enjoying working with people is incredibly important. I love 99.9% of my patients. There's always going to be one, I suppose. But I mean, I've had 3 phone calls today from patients. I give them my phone number. If they're running into issues or problems, I don't give everyone my phone, but people I'm concerned about, because I'm not in a practice every day of the week, and I'm hard to otherwise find. So you've got to enjoy being in the human race and helping it the best you can.
Well, that's certainly some good advice. I'm going to jump into a slight change of direction here. We're getting questions to do with the question of transfusion contamination, or whether there's any issue, and I have no idea. But whether there is known to be any issue where someone who's received one of these mRNA vaccines in the past, does that, if they then give blood and someone who's unvaccinated receives blood, do we know anything yet about what gets transferred? Is that, in essence, are we now moving that RNA or the mRNA material into that next person's body?
Well, I wish you hadn't have asked me the question, because I don't know the answer any more than you do or anyone else does. I work on the basis that if you need blood, then you take blood, because if you're getting blood, you're going to get blood from somebody who almost certainly has had a vaccine. If I had a bleeding ulcer or something like that and my life depended on having a blood transfusion, I wouldn't even ask the question. To the best of my knowledge, there's no evidence that there's any downside in getting blood from people who have been vaccinated. I have no evidence. I've not seen evidence. I'm aware of the questions. So I think it's a terrible thing for people to go away thinking they shouldn't. If you need blood, you take blood.
Yep, that's probably, in the absence of clear evidence to the contrary, that's probably very, very fair. I want to move away from
in the morning.
Yeah, that's right. I want to move away from COVID. We've spent an hour talking all about that side of things. I don't know why I'm holding my cigar cutter. I'm not having a cigar today, just out of force of habit, I guess. And I wanted to, you've been involved in many areas of medical practice over your, as you say, more than 50-year career. We've seen a lot of medical fads come and go, a lot of diets in particular. That's an area that's particularly prone to fattery and health in general. You know, at the moment we're seeing these cold showers. Everyone's talking about, oh, you've got to take a cold shower. At the end of your shower, just turn the cold water on full blast and give yourself a cold shock. And people talk about the benefits that apparently has. Another one is the carnivore diet. And we've got, where was it? I saw a comment here or a question here a minute ago. No, I've lost it. Oh, here we go. Mr. Stew's asking, what are your views on carnivore, if you have any? I want to ask a more broad question than that. What are some of the things over the years? Sorry,
ask the question.
Yeah. So what are your views, or what are some of the things that you've seen over the years, whether they're still in fashion or not, that you believe would actually really make a difference, would move the needle if more people did them? What are some of the things, whether it's carnivore or cold showers, or whether it's something perhaps that went out of fashion 40 years ago, what do you believe would make a real world practical improvement in the average health if more people did it?
Well, I've got no more insight than the smart person in the street. You eat well, you sleep well, you keep your weight down, you don't smoke, and you exercise. All of these things are incredibly important. I mean, we live in the middle of the city, and yet we try to walk 4 to 5 Ks a day. We've got the Botanic Gardens, we've got Barangaroo, the fish markets, we've got lots of places. I'm not a great example for keeping my weight down, but I wished I was. Look, it's quite interesting. Many years ago, I worked at McMaster University in Canada, where I got involved with mucosal immunology from the late great John Bienenstock. And when I came back, immunology didn't exist in Australia. And immunology is a very interesting area of medicine because it cuts across the different specialties. So no matter who you see as a patient, you know, one of your colleagues is going to see you as a threat. If you see someone with an immune problem in the heart or the gut or the liver, the specialists in those vertical specialties see you as a threat. Not that you ever set out to be a threat. I was just always interested. So I came back to Prince Alfred Hospital and I set up the clinical immunology clinical unit there. It had a very good lab, but didn't have a clinical service of much substance. So I was the first clinical immunologist there. And I started looking to see what I could really develop a special area of interest in. And I found very quickly that my rheumatology friends were very happy for me not to see people with joint problems. And I said, what am I going to do? And I spoke to the late, great Ron Kenny, who many people, who was a marvelous man. And it was the one person I could ring up and get help from in those days. And I said to Ron, what on earth should I be doing? And he said, I'm going to send you 3 patients with urticaria. Now, urticaria is where you get itchy wheals on your skin. You know, you get hives all over. Okay. And it's a terribly nuisance problem. So I thought, well, I did a bit of reading and found that around the world, people were treating it with diet. So we set up I set up a clinic, and we actually saw hundreds of patients with urticaria. And I did it with, I walked into the dietitian's department and said, is there a bright young lady here? Because they're all girls doing dietetics in those days. And is there someone who would like to come and work with me on what we can do with diet? Well, Anne Swain was the person who came. She's now retired, I believe. And Anne did a PhD on this and changed the way people looked after urticaria using diet. And in many ways, it really changed the momentum of dietetics. And it's gone much, much further than that now. And so the modern dietitian is a therapeutic dietitian. Obviously, you know, there's so much can be done with obesity, diabetes, but also therapeutically, particularly with gut disease. You know, everyone and his dog's got a favorite diet. And I'm certainly no longer, I guess I was a short-term expert a long time ago, but it began in many ways, with this approach to controlling this itchy skin disease, where the mast cells in the body became very twitchy when you had a lot of salicylate or preservatives from preserved food, tartrazine, colouring matter, a number of these things. You took them out of the diet and people improved. And then we'd challenge people to see which of the different ones, and then we could identify a particular diet to control. So that concept was one that developed. And it's gone a long way. People in Melbourne have developed a particular diet for irritable bowel syndrome. It only seems to work south of the Yarra, but no, it does work up here too a bit.
I grew up in Melbourne, so I'm very familiar with the south of the Yarra, north of the Yarra rivalries in Melbourne. So that tickled my fancy. Thank you. Look, Professor, this has been an absolutely brilliant conversation, and thank you to everyone watching. We've got nearly 1,000 people still online after more than an hour, and putting up with the initial connection issues that we had. And thank you, Professor, for turning your camera off. The audio has actually been a lot better since then. I kind of want to finish with a bit of a free kick. Is there anything that you see as really important or urgent that you would like for our audience? And like I say, there's the better part of 1,000 people still watching. What would you like to pass on to people while they're here and you've got their attention that might make a difference?
Well, when you ask a question like that, it's going to be a rather personal response, and I haven't thought about it too much. But you asked a question early on that I purposely didn't answer, but I'll have a go at it. And that was, what should we be doing in approaching conditions like COVID? And my view is that you're not going to have huge major impact with any form of vaccination as we understand it today. Certainly not with, we have to get rid of these genetic vaccines and go back to making them safer and just as effective. We have to accept that there are some very, very useful drugs that can change the outcome. And it's shameful to me that the doctors in this country were prevented from using it. But I think we've got to think differently. And the way this is what I've done for 40, 50 years, and that is trying to understand how you can make people get less intense COVID. So rather than treating the bug, the virus, with antivirals, how can we change the immune response so that people are more resilient? Now, if I take 100 people like you, Topher, and you get COVID, most of you will do quite well. But 4 or 5% will get quite sick. 1 or 2 may go to hospital, and maybe occasional one could even die. What is the difference between the one person who gets very sick and the person who gets a sniffle? And the main difference is the competence of the mucosal immune response. And what we can now do, we can change that competence. We can de-risk people. They all look the same. Line them up as 100. They all look pretty much the same. But they've got a different way of, you can shift their immune resilience by making their immune response more effective. And there are ways that this is my personal interest. And we can, for example, if people who have got chronic airways disease, we can reduce by up to 50% their admission rate to hospital, people with emphysema, by simply shifting the resilience of their immune response. We can stop people who are smokers from getting the pathogens getting into the air, the gas exchange part of their lung. We can do that very, very simply. And we're working, and we've actually got products in the pipeline that can do that. So my view is generally that we have to change. We've got to think outside the box and understand the process and say, how can we make this work better so that people don't get into strife? And I think now's the time to do it before we get the H5N1 or the next, really nasty flu or coronavirus pandemic that comes. So that would be my immediate response. But of course, that's my personal view, and it's very close to what I do and have done for 40 years.
Well, thank you so much for sharing just this wealth of knowledge that you have, and very, very grateful for your time this evening. To everyone watching, please make sure you leave a like. If you haven't already, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Share this with us. Is there anywhere where you want people to follow your work, Professor Clancy? Do you sort of have a website or a blog or any social media?
I don't even know how to access social media. That's a great blessing. A great blessing of mine. Now, look, no, it's not about me. This is not about me. This is about you people listening understand you. I mean, just take climate change, take any of these things. None of us work hard enough to understand the particular silos that aren't our silos. We get very good on our silo. I know a lot about immunology. I know a lot about COVID, and I see terrible things happening. But I talk to friends who know a lot about other things, and they say the same sorts of things about their silos. So I think somehow we've got to have a more open discussion, more debate. I think public debate is so important, so we don't get imposed on us the political views of a select advantaged group of individuals. Maybe that's really the answer. We can't even get a debate going in the College of Physicians. I tried to in the College of Pathologists, because I'm also a member of that. I don't even get answers. The first time I wrote, I didn't get it to my own college, and I used to run their education committee. You know, it's extraordinary that people do not want to have public, open discussion. And here we are trying to shut down freedom of communication when we don't even have it.
Yeah, that's very, very true. There may not be a misinformation, disinformation bill yet, but there's certainly suppression of anything that doesn't fit their narrative.
Everything you and I have talked about tonight will be labelled misinformation.
It's interesting, though. There's not a lot of things that were labelled misinformation in 2020 and 21 that is still considered misinformation. It's interesting that list that is.
Oh yes, a lot of people still do. I mean, look at going back to the WHO, which we must not let that go through. WHO still has hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin as not recommended. Look, I'm treating people with post-COVID syndromes, and I've had bedridden people stand up. I mean, not everyone, but I'm just saying that there are things that we're being told that are just not true.
There's a great question here from Catherine Cavaney, and it actually relates to, we touched on this briefly, Catherine. I'm guessing you might have joined us a little bit later, but we did kind of move on from this very, very quickly. And her question is, what do you think of the treatment of Professor Petrovsky and the destruction of his research? Now, of course, we did touch on that, but I think there's a lot of people that really might not even be aware of what's happened. Is there kind of a 5-minute rundown that you could give us, Professor? I know you mentioned that he developed a vaccine that sold many millions in the Middle East, etc.
Okay. I'll give you the 4-minute. Nick Petrovsky is a very smart guy. He's a vaccinologist. He developed a very clever, what we call antigen-based vaccine, quite different to the messenger RNA ones, which has undergone thorough safety reviews, thorough clinical views, and clinically it's at least as good as anything else that's come out of the messenger RNA or the DNA vector vaccines. It's Australian, it's cheaper, it's safer, and it's at least as effective. He has been kicked out of the university on the grounds that he refused to have a messenger RNA. I don't know, my guess is, I've heard that he wouldn't have the messenger RNA vaccine. He had his own vaccine, but that wasn't good enough. He was told by the university he wasn't doing enough for the university. He was bringing in tens of millions of dollars, American money, to develop this vaccine. It's been used in over 10 million people effectively without significant complications. And this guy has been kicked out of his university. My personal view is that the universities now see so much money coming out of the big pharma companies that they will do, they'll sing the tune of the pharma company, and the pharma companies work, they shut down anything that's going to affect their bottom line. And everyone knows that. It's not a secret. And yet we let them do it in this country. We let them do it.
So do we know where Professor Petrovsky is going next? Does he have any other doors open?
I'm putting out a book with an amazing family practitioner in northern Queensland, Mel McCann, who you probably know Mel. Mel's one of my heroines. She really is. Well, Mel and I are trying to get the best people in the country to put out a book, basically to educate people, and we're calling it Through Our Eyes, the COVID pandemic. And Nick's just sent me we asked Nick to do it as the vaccinologist. And so he's still in Australia somewhere. I just feel for the guy so much. It's the most appalling bad act I've seen in a university in 50 years of being a university professor or student. It's appalling, absolutely appalling.
Could not agree more. Keep an eye out for that book that Dr. Mel McCann is putting together. If it's the one that I'm thinking of, then she asked me for a chapter, obviously nothing related to medical side of things, but for a bit of an on the ground account of the psychological and mental health effects of the non-pharmaceutical interventions, specifically the lockdowns.
I haven't seen your draft yet, Topher. So are you going to promise online that you're going to write it?
I know I have written it. I've sent it off to her,
terrific.
Yeah, I believe I'll have a chapter in there as well. But look, I look forward to seeing that publication. When it comes out, I'll make sure I let everybody know. Look, Professor, I'd better let you go, but tonight has been an absolute thrill. You've been incredibly generous with your time and knowledge. Thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone who's been watching all the way through. Please enjoy the rest of your evening and tune in on Thursday night next week at 8 p.m. for another Topher Field podcast. Professor Robert Clancy, thank you so very much.
My pleasure.